Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. You ever drive through a town where nobody smiles, where kids don't play, where something feels off? Last December, 7 small towns in the Appalachian Mountains went silent. Not empty people were still there, but they weren't people anymore. What I'm about to tell you actually happened, and honestly, I wish it didn't. Subscribe and hit like if you want more. Comment where you're from. Let's see who's brave. Keep the lights on for this one.
My name's Maria Gonzalez, and I'm 31 years old. I work for the Postal Service back in Roanoke, Virginia. Been doing mail routes for about 8 years now. It's honest work, keeps me moving, and the pay's decent enough to support my 2 kids since my divorce went through last spring. I've always been the practical type, you know? The kind of person who double-checks the locks at night and keeps a first aid kit in my car. My ex-husband used to joke that I could spot trouble from a mile away, which is probably why our marriage lasted as long as it did. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what started happening in early December 2019. It began with dreams, not the normal kind where you wake up and forget them by breakfast, but the vivid, stick-with-you-all-day type that feel more real than being awake. In these dreams, I was standing in the middle of a small town I'd never seen before, watching people I didn't know go about their Christmas preparations. There was a main street lined with old brick buildings, a little church with a white steeple, and mountains rising up all around like protective walls. The town felt peaceful, safe even, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and strangers get invited to dinner. But then the dreams would shift. Same town, same people, but now it was December 23rd, and something terrible was happening. I'd watch helplessly as this thing moved through the streets. I can't even properly describe what it was. Sometimes it looked like shadow, sometimes like a person, but always wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. And everywhere it went, people died. Not just died, they were slaughtered, torn apart like they were nothing more than paper dolls. The worst part was how clear everything was. I knew exactly who would die first, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop. I knew she'd be arranging poinsettias in her front window when it found her. I knew about the young father who'd be carrying Christmas presents to his car, about the teenage girl who'd be walking her dog, about the sheriff who'd try to fight back with his service weapon. I saw it all, over and over, night after night. After about a week of these dreams, I started writing everything down. Times, names, descriptions of the people and places. I figured maybe if I documented it all, I could convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the details never changed. Every dream showed me the exact same events, the exact same deaths, the exact same timeline. December 23rd, starting at 6:47 p.m., ending just after midnight with most of the town's population dead. Then I saw the welcome sign. Willowbrook, Virginia. Population 847. Founded 1889. I looked it up online and my blood went cold. It was a real place. About 4 hours east of Roanoke, tucked away in a valley near the Blue Ridge Mountains. The population matched. The layout of Main Street matched. Even the church looked exactly like what I'd seen in my dreams. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I'd driven through Willowbrook years ago and forgotten about it, and my subconscious was just recycling old memories into nightmares. But when I dug deeper into the town's history and current residents, I found pictures on the Willowbrook Chamber of Commerce website. Mrs. Emily Henderson, flower shop owner. Sheriff Tom Bradley, married, 2 kids. Mayor Linda Foster, local real estate agent turned politician. Dr. James Mitchell, the town's only physician. Every single person I'd seen die in my dreams was real, living their lives in that little mountain town, completely unaware that something was coming for them. The dreams kept getting more detailed. I learned the layout of every building, the names of streets I'd never walked down, the faces of children who played in the town park. I knew that the Baptist church held evening services on Wednesdays, that the diner served the best apple pie in 3 counties, that teenagers liked to hang out behind the old mill on Friday nights. I was becoming an expert on a place I'd never been, filled with people I'd never met, all of whom were going to die in 11 days. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I called in sick to work. told my supervisor I had a family emergency, and started driving toward Willowbrook. I had no plan beyond getting there, and somehow convincing everyone to leave town on December 23rd. Looking back now, I realize how crazy that must have sounded. A complete stranger showing up and telling everyone they were going to die based on dreams, but I had to try. The alternative was letting 800+ people get slaughtered because I was too afraid to look foolish. I arrived in Willowbrook on December 12th, exactly as the late afternoon sun was painting the mountains golden. The town looked like a postcard, all decorated for Christmas with garlands strung between the lampposts and wreaths on every door. I parked my Honda in front of Henderson's Flowers and just sat there for a moment, staring at the woman I'd watched die 100 times in my sleep. She was real, arranging flowers just like in my dreams, humming some Christmas song I couldn't quite hear through the glass. I walked into the flower shop and Mrs. Henderson looked up with the kind of genuine smile you only get in small towns. "Well, hello there, honey. You're not from around here, are you?" "No, ma'am," I said, suddenly aware of how insane I was about to sound. "My name's Maria Gonzalez, and I'm here because, well, this is going to sound crazy, but I think your town is in danger." Her smile faltered just a little. "What kind of danger, dear?" I took a deep breath. "Something terrible is going to happen here on December 23rd. A lot of people are going to die unless everyone leaves town that day." Mrs. Henderson set down her scissors and really looked at me for the first time. I could see her taking in my Postal Service uniform, my Virginia accent, the bags under my eyes from weeks of nightmares. "And how exactly do you know this?" "I've been having dreams," I said, and immediately regretted how weak that sounded. "But they're not normal dreams. They're detailed, specific. I know things about this town I shouldn't know. I know you close the shop at 6 p.m. on weekdays, and that you've got a tabby cat named Mittens who likes to sleep in the front window." Her face went pale. Mittens was, at that exact moment, curled up on a cushion behind the register. "I know Sheriff Bradley drives a 2015 Ford Explorer, and that he's got a scar on his left hand from a fishing accident when he was 12, I continued. "I know Mayor Foster has been trying to get the state to fund a new water treatment plant for 3 years. I know Dr. Mitchell's office is above the pharmacy, and he's been treating old Mr. Peterson for diabetes." Mrs. Henderson backed away from the counter. "How do you know all that?" "Because I've seen this town in my dreams every night for 2 weeks. And in every dream, everyone dies on December 23rd unless they're somewhere else." She asked me to leave, politely but firmly. Said she was going to call the sheriff if I kept spreading nonsense that might scare people. I tried explaining about the creature, about the timeline, about the specific ways people would die, but she just kept shaking her head and backing toward the phone. So I left and tried the sheriff's department next. Sheriff Bradley was exactly what I expected. Mid-40s, stocky build, the kind of weathered face that comes from spending time outdoors. He listened to my whole story without interrupting, which I took as a good sign until he started asking questions. "Ma'am, have you been taking any medications recently? Any history of mental illness in your family? When's the last time you saw a doctor?" I tried to prove my legitimacy by predicting small things. Told him his dispatcher would get a call about Mrs. Kowalski's cat being stuck in a tree at 4:23 p.m. Told him the high school principal would call about vandalism in the parking lot before 5 p.m. Both calls came in exactly when I said they would, but Sheriff Bradley just chalked it up to coincidence. "Look, Miss Gonzalez," he said, "I appreciate your concern, but I can't evacuate an entire town based on dreams. Even if some of your predictions have been accurate, that doesn't mean anything supernatural is going to happen." I spent the next 3 days trying different approaches. I talked to Mayor Foster, explaining the economic benefits of having everyone take a little Christmas vacation. She seemed interested until I mentioned the dreams, then suddenly remembered an urgent meeting she had to attend. I tried Dr. Mitchell, thinking a medical professional might be more open to unusual phenomena. He offered to prescribe me something for anxiety and suggested I might benefit from speaking with a psychiatrist. Each rejection made me more desperate. I started approaching random people on the street, describing their homes, their families, their personal histories that I had no business knowing. Some got scared and called the police. Others just thought I was some kind of con artist running an elaborate scam. A few listened long enough for me to describe their deaths in detail, which usually sent them running. By December 15th, The word had spread around town about the crazy lady with the prophecies. People crossed the street to avoid me. The diner wouldn't serve me. Mrs. Henderson had banned me from her shop, and Sheriff Bradley had strongly suggested I might be happier somewhere else. But I couldn't leave. Every night, the dreams got more vivid. I could smell the winter air, feel the crunch of snow under my feet, hear the Christmas carols playing from the speakers mounted on the lampposts. And every night, I watched the same massacre unfold. The creature, whatever it was, moved through town like it was following a predetermined route. It would start at the church during evening service, then work its way down Main Street, then spread out into the residential areas. By midnight, Willowbrook would be a ghost town. The strangest part was how the creature seemed to know everyone. It didn't hunt randomly. It sought out specific people, called them by name before killing them. In my dreams, I heard it speaking in voices of people who died years ago, residents of Willowbrook who'd passed away but somehow never left. On December 18th, I tried a different strategy. Instead of warning about the creature directly, I started making anonymous calls about gas leaks, electrical fires, anything that might get people to evacuate their homes on the 23rd. I called the school district, claiming there was asbestos in the building. I called the water department, saying I'd spotted contamination in the reservoir. Every call was investigated and dismissed. But at least people were starting to take my warnings seriously enough to check them out. Sheriff Bradley pulled me over that afternoon. "Ma'am, making false emergency reports is a felony. I'm trying to be understanding here, but you're forcing my hand. 5 days," I told him. "That's all you've got left. 5 days. And then you're going to watch everyone you care about die because you wouldn't listen to a woman with dreams." Something in my voice must have gotten to him because he didn't arrest me. Instead, he asked me to meet him at the diner after his shift. We sat in a corner booth while I laid out everything I knew about December 23rd. Every detail, every timeline, every death in the order they would happen. "Let's say, hypothetically, that I believe you," he said finally. "What exactly am I supposed to do? I can't force people to leave their homes because a stranger had bad dreams." "You could try," I said. "You could at least warn them. Tell them there's been a credible threat. Make something up if you have to." He promised to think about it, but I could tell he was just humoring me. The next day, I overheard him talking to Mayor Foster about having me committed for psychiatric evaluation. That's when Dr. Mitchell got involved. He'd been asked to assess my mental state for the county, determine whether I posed a threat to myself or others. We met in his office above the pharmacy on December 20th, 3 days before the massacre. "Maria," he said, using my first name for the first time, "I've reviewed your background. You're a single mother, steady employment, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. Your ex-husband describes you as annoyingly practical and the most level-headed person I know. Your supervisor at the Postal Service says you've never missed work except for family emergencies, and you're being considered for a promotion. None of this fits the profile of someone experiencing a psychotic break. So you believe me?" "I believe you're not crazy," he said carefully. "That doesn't mean I believe in prophetic dreams. But you've demonstrated knowledge about this town and its residents that's impossible to explain. Either you're running an extremely elaborate con for reasons I can't fathom, or something genuinely unusual is happening here." Dr. Mitchell turned out to be my only ally. He couldn't officially endorse my warnings. His medical license depended on staying within the bounds of rational explanation, but he quietly suggested to several families that they might want to visit relatives out of town for Christmas. A few listened, most didn't. December 22nd was the longest day of my life. I spent it walking through town, memorizing faces, trying to burn every detail into my memory so I could prove what happened afterward. If there was an afterward, the dreams had never shown me surviving. I was just an observer, watching from some impossible perspective as the creature did its work. That evening, I positioned myself across from the Baptist church. Service started at 7 p.m., just like always, and through the windows I could see families gathering for their Sunday evening worship. Mrs. Henderson was there with her sister from Richmond. The Bradley family had taken their usual spot in the third pew. Dr. Mitchell sat near the back, which struck me as odd since he'd never attended church in any of my dreams. At 6:47 p.m., exactly as I'd seen 100 times before, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, all at once, like someone had opened a door to winter in the middle of winter. My breath started fogging, even though it had been relatively mild for December. Streetlights flickered. Dogs started barking throughout the town. Then I saw it. The creature emerged from the old cemetery behind the church, moving like shadow made solid. In my dreams, I'd never been able to see it clearly, but now, watching with my own eyes, I could make out impossible details. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, and seemed to be wearing clothes from different time periods all layered together. A Civil War-era coat over a 1,950 seconds dress over what looked like a colonial shirt. As it got closer, I realized these weren't clothes at all, but the actual garments of people who had died in Willowbrook over the past century and a half. The thing's face was the worst part. It wasn't one face but dozens, shifting and changing like a deck of cards being shuffled. Old faces, young faces, familiar faces of people I'd seen in the town's historical records. All of them dead. All of them hungry. It walked straight to the church and pushed open the front doors. The singing inside stopped. Then the screaming started. I ran toward the building, but my feet felt like they were moving through molasses. The closer I got to the creature, the harder it became to move, like the air itself was fighting against me. Through the windows, I could see chaos inside. People trying to run, trying to hide, trying to fight something that couldn't be fought with human strength. Mrs. Henderson died first, just like in my dreams. The creature called her name in a voice I recognized as her long-dead husband, and when she turned toward the sound, it reached out with fingers that were too long and too sharp. Sheriff Bradley tried to draw his weapon, but his hands wouldn't obey him. The creature spoke to him in his father's voice, telling him to come home, that it was time to join the family business of keeping Willowbrook's secrets. I made it to the church steps before the weight of the creature's presence drove me to my knees. This close, I could hear what it was saying to its victims, and I finally understood what Willowbrook really was. The town had been built on a mass grave. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers had massacred a Native American settlement and buried the bodies in a ravine that later became the site of Willowbrook's foundation. Every building, every street, every happy memory was constructed on top of bones and broken promises. The creature wasn't some random evil. It was the accumulated rage and sorrow of people who'd been murdered and forgotten, feeding on the life force of those who'd built their happiness on top of stolen land. But it wasn't satisfied with just killing. It was collecting. Every person who died became part of it, added their voice to its chorus of the dead. That's why it could call people by name, why it knew their histories and their fears. It was becoming Willowbrook, absorbing the entire town into itself, so that no one would ever forget what had happened here. The massacre lasted 3 hours. I couldn't move, couldn't help, couldn't even look away. I was forced to witness every death exactly as I'd seen them in my dreams. The only difference was that now I knew why I'd been shown these visions. I wasn't meant to prevent the disaster. I was meant to remember it, to carry the story forward so that this time the dead wouldn't be forgotten. When it was over, the creature turned to look at me. Its face had become a collage of everyone who died that night. Mrs. Henderson's kind eyes, Sheriff Bradley's determined jawline, Dr. Mitchell's thoughtful expression, all blended together into something that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. "You will tell them," it said in a voice that was 100 voices speaking in harmony. "You will remember us all." Then it walked back toward the cemetery, leaving me alone in a town full of bodies. I called 911 from Sheriff Bradley's radio, but it took hours for help to arrive. Willowbrook was isolated enough that news of the massacre didn't spread immediately, and when it did, authorities couldn't explain what had happened. The official report blamed it on a gas leak that caused mass hallucinations leading to a stampede. The few survivors, mostly people who'd been out of town that night, were quietly relocated and encouraged not to speak about what they'd witnessed. I tried telling my story to journalists, investigators, anyone who would listen. They all wanted to know how I'd known the massacre was coming, why I'd been in Willowbrook in the first place, why I was the only person in town who'd survived without a scratch. The more I explained about the dreams, the less credible I became. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince people. I went back to my job at the Postal Service, back to raising my kids, back to my normal life. But the dreams never stopped. Now they show me other places, other disasters, other towns built on forgotten graves. I've learned to recognize the signs, the historical patterns, the ways certain places seem to echo with old pain. I've prevented 3 massacres since Willowbrook, though nobody knows it. Anonymous tips, carefully planned evacuations, false emergencies that clear buildings just before something terrible happens. It's not much, but it's something. Sometimes I wonder if this is my punishment for surviving when everyone else died, or if it's my purpose. Maybe there's no difference. All I know is that I've got dreams scheduled for the next 40 years, and each one shows me people who are going to die unless someone believes a woman with impossible knowledge and enough determination to look crazy in service of keeping others alive. The hardest part isn't the skepticism or the fear people show when I try to warn them. It's the weight of carrying all these stories, all these deaths, all these places that exist in the space between history and horror. Every night, I dream of people who are already dead. And every day, I try to save people who don't know they're about to die. It's not much of a life, but it's the one I've got. And somewhere out there, in towns built on graves I haven't dreamed of yet, people are sleeping peacefully because they don't know what's coming for them. I envy them that peace. But I wouldn't trade my burden for it, because somebody has to remember the dead, somebody has to carry their stories forward, somebody has to make sure that this time they won't be forgotten. Even if that somebody is just a postal worker from Roanoke who learned too late that some places never let go of their pain. My name is Robert Thompson, and I've been working as an insurance adjuster for 14 years now. Most people don't really understand what that means until they need me. I'm the guy who shows up after your house burns down or a tree falls through your roof, and I figure out how much money you're getting from your insurance company. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent. And after seeing so much loss and tragedy over the years, you develop a kind of professional distance that helps you sleep at night. At least that's what I thought until December of 2024, when I discovered that some kinds of grief never let go. And sometimes that's exactly what they're counting on. I was 37 then, recently divorced, and still dealing with my dad's death from the previous spring. Cancer took him fast, too fast for either of us to have the conversations we should have had. I'd been throwing myself into work to avoid thinking about it, taking on the weird cases nobody else wanted to touch. That's how I ended up getting assigned to investigate some insurance claims that had been filed for victims of a Christmas Eve fire in Ashwood Falls, a fire that happened in 1995. The claims were recent, filed just months ago, but they were for people who had been dead for nearly 30 years. But what made the case truly bizarre wasn't just the timing. It was the signatures. Every single claim form was signed in the same handwriting, a child's careful cursive, like someone had learned to write their name in school and never changed their penmanship. 20 different names, all in that same young hand. My supervisor, Janet, called me into her office on a cold Tuesday morning in early December. "Bobby, I've got something that'll keep you up at night," she said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. The folder felt unnaturally cold to the touch. These claims came in through our legacy system. Apparently there was a fire in Ashwood Falls back in '95. Whole town burned down on Christmas Eve. Now, 30 years later, someone's filing claims for life insurance policies on people who died in that fire. I opened the folder and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Claim after claim, all filed within the last 6 months, all for residents of Ashwood Falls who had perished in 1995. But the photographs attached to each claim were what made my blood run cold. They showed the claimants, all adults in their 30s and 40s, but in every single photo, the people looked wrong. Their eyes were too wide, too desperate, and they all had the same expression of terrible longing. "Could be fraud," Janet continued, but her voice lacked conviction. "Corporate wants us to investigate before we pay out anything. The total claims add up to almost $2 million. But, Bobby," she paused, looking uncomfortable. "3 other adjusters have been assigned to this case before you. All 3 requested transfers to different departments after visiting the site. They won't say why. I'd handled plenty of fraud cases before, but this was different. Usually, insurance fraud involves fake accidents or inflated damages. This felt like something else entirely. I spent the next few days researching Ashwood Falls, and what I found made the whole situation even more disturbing. The town had been a small mountain community in southwestern Virginia, population around 180. On Christmas Eve, 1995, a massive fire had swept through the entire town during a holiday celebration. But the more I dug into the official records, the more inconsistencies I found. The fire department's response time was listed as 47 minutes. Impossibly long for such a small area. The survivor interviews were brief, almost perfunctory, and all 20 children gave identical accounts of the fire, down to specific details about smoke patterns and escape routes. Most disturbing was what I found in the county coroner's records. The fire had burned so hot and fast that most of the adult victims were found in perfect family groupings, husbands and wives embracing, parents shielding children who had somehow still died despite their protection. The bodies showed signs of smoke inhalation, but autopsies revealed something else, traces of sedatives in their blood. Every single adult victim had been drugged. After the fire, the 20 surviving children were taken in by relatives in other states, and Ashwood Falls was officially abandoned. According to county records, it remained empty, a ghost town slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But there was one detail that stuck with me. Every December, for the past 29 years, park rangers reported seeing lights in the valley where Ashwood Falls had stood. When investigated, they found nothing but charred foundations and ash. I decided I needed to visit the site myself, despite the warnings from my predecessors. It was a 4-hour drive from Richmond up into the mountains. The deeper I got into Appalachian country, the more isolated I felt. Cell towers were sparse, GPS signals became unreliable, and the roads seemed to twist in ways that didn't match my maps. I reached the turnoff for Ashwood Falls, just as the sun was starting to set on December 15th. According to my research, the town should have been about 2 miles up a gravel road that branched off from the main highway. The road sign was old and weathered, with something carved below the town name that I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. As I drove up that gravel road, my car radio began picking up a signal. Children's voices singing Christmas carols. The music was faint but persistent, and no matter how I adjusted the tuning, I couldn't find a clear station. The singing had an eerie quality, like it was coming from very far away or very long ago. When I crested the hill and looked down into the valley where Ashwood Falls had once stood, I had to pull over and just stare. The town was there. Not ruins, not foundations, but actual buildings with lights in the windows and smoke rising from chimneys. I could see people walking along what looked like a main street, and there were cars parked in front of a general store, but all the vehicles looked like models from the 1992. Christmas decorations hung from lampposts, and I could hear the faint sound of music drifting up from the valley. The same children's voices from my radio. But something was wrong with the scene. The movements of the people below were too slow, too deliberate. The smoke from the chimneys rose perfectly straight up, unaffected by wind. And all the lights in the windows had a reddish tinge, like they were being filtered through something dark. I sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind suggested I'd made a wrong turn, that this was a different town. But when I checked my map again, there was no other settlement marked in this area. And the road sign behind me definitely said, Ashwood Falls, 2 miles. I drove down into the valley as the last light faded from the sky. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The buildings looked old but well-maintained, like you'd expect in a small mountain town, but there was something off about their proportions. Doorways seemed slightly too narrow, windows slightly too small, as if everything had been built for people who were smaller than they should be. I parked in front of what looked like the main inn, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign that read Ashwood Inn, Est, 1987. Through the windows, I could see a warm, inviting lobby with a fireplace, but the fire cast shadows that moved independently of the flames. The woman behind the front desk was probably in her 50s, with graying hair and a smile that stretched just a little too wide. She looked up when I came in and said, "You must be Mr. Thompson. We've been expecting you." "I'm sorry, how did you know?" "The children told us you were coming," she said, her smile never wavering. "They're very excited to meet you. I'm Mary Patterson. I run the inn here. You'll be staying in room 7. She handed me an old-fashioned skeleton key without asking for a credit card or any identification. When I touched the key, it was ice cold despite the warm lobby. "Mrs. Patterson, I said. "I'm here about some insurance claims related to the fire in 1995. Do you know anything about that?" Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, something hungry. "Oh yes, the fire. That was a terrible thing. But the children remember everything. They've been waiting so long to tell someone about it." "Children?" "I thought the children were adopted out of state after the fire." "They come back," Mary said simply. "Every December, they come back. They can't stay away. This is their home, Mr. Thompson. This is where their families are." I wanted to press her for more information, but something in her tone suggested that would be unwise. I took my key and went upstairs to my room. Room 7 was at the end of a hallway that seemed longer than the building could accommodate. The walls were covered in old photographs, family portraits from what looked like the 1992. In every picture, the families were posed perfectly, smiling perfectly, but their eyes held the same desperate quality I'd seen in the insurance claim photos. The room itself was comfortable enough, old-fashioned but clean, with a view of the main street. I could see people still moving around down there, despite the late hour, but their movements had that same unnaturally slow quality, and I began to notice that none of them seemed to be breathing. No visible exhale in the cold air, no natural rise and fall of chests. I tried calling Janet to let her know I'd arrived, but my cell phone showed no signal. The landline in the room produced only static when I picked it up, static that almost sounded like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the town below. I could hear voices, footsteps, cars starting up, all the normal sounds of a community settling in for the night. But underneath it all, there was something else. A sound like children crying, distant but persistent, mixed with what might have been adult voices calling out names. Around midnight, I heard my door handle turn. I watched from my bed as the door slowly opened, revealing a small figure silhouetted against the hallway light. A child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing pajamas that looked like they'd been burned and then carefully mended. "Mr. Thompson?" the child whispered. "We need to show you something." I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt an overwhelming sadness. The child looked so lost, so desperate. "What do you need to show me?" "How it really happened," the child said. "The grown-ups, they won't tell the truth. But we remember. We remember everything." I followed the child downstairs and out into the night. The street was full of them now. 20 children, all between the ages of 7 and 12, all wearing clothes that showed signs of fire damage. They surrounded me, not threateningly, but with an urgency that was almost palpable. "This way," said a girl with singed pigtails. "We'll show you the community center." They led me through the town to a large building at the far end of the main street. It looked exactly like the others, well-maintained, normal. But when we got closer, I could see scorch marks around the windows that seemed to move and shift in the moonlight. "This is where it started," said a boy with soot-stained cheeks. But not like they said, not an accident. The children pressed around me as we entered the building. Inside, it was set up for a Christmas celebration. Decorated tree, tables laden with food, presents wrapped in paper that crackled like flames. But everything was wrong. The decorations were too perfect. The food too fresh for something that had been sitting for 30 years. The presents wrapped in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "They made us watch," whispered the girl with pigtails. "Made us watch while they did it." "Who?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be terrible. "The grown-ups," said the boy. "Our grown-ups, our moms and dads." The truth came out in pieces, told by 20 young voices that overlapped and interrupted each other, creating a horrifying chorus of revelation. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been planned, orchestrated by the adults of Ashwood Falls, in a ritual that was supposed to bind their families together forever. The sedatives in their blood hadn't been from smoke inhalation. They'd been administered deliberately to make the transition easier. But the ritual had gone wrong. Instead of joining their families in death, the 20 children had been spared, forced to watch as their parents and siblings burned themselves alive in what they believed would be a gateway to eternal togetherness. The children had survived, traumatized beyond healing, carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. "They thought they were saving us," whispered a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7. "Thought they were keeping the family together forever, but they just trapped us with them. The grown-ups are still here," said the girl with pigtails, still trying to complete their ritual. Every December, they get stronger. Every December, we get pulled back. And every December, they need someone new to finish what they started. Someone who understands loss, added another child. Someone who's grieving. Someone who wants their family back. That's when I understood why I was really there. Not to investigate insurance fraud, but to serve as the final component in a ritual that had been 30 years in the making. My grief for my father, my professional expertise with death and loss, my presence in this place during December, it was all part of something larger and more terrible than I could have imagined. The children led me back outside, where the adult residents of Ashwood Falls were waiting. Mary Patterson stood at the front of the group, but now I could see her clearly. Her skin was waxy and translucent, her smile too wide because the fire had burned away parts of her face that had been filled in with shadow and longing. Behind her, dozens of other adults stood in perfect family groups, all showing signs of fire damage, all staring at me with that same desperate hunger. "We've been waiting so long," Mary said, her voice crackling like burning wood, "waiting for someone who could understand, someone who could help us finish bringing our children home." "They're already home," I said, backing away. "The children are here with you." "No," said a man who might have been Mary's husband, his voice hollow and echoing. "These are just echoes. Memories. Our real children are out there, living half-lives, unable to move on because they're still connected to us, still bound by love and trauma. We need to complete the circle. We need to bring them back permanently." The burned adults began to move toward me, and I could feel the heat radiating from their bodies. The air itself began to shimmer and smoke, and I realized that my presence was somehow feeding their power, making them more solid, more real. "The ritual requires a witness," Mary continued, "someone who understands the weight of loss, someone who can call them home with authority. Your grief opened the door, Mr. Thompson. Your professional expertise with death claims makes you the perfect conduit." I ran. Behind me, I could hear the children screaming, not in fear, but in warning. "Don't let them finish it," they cried. "Don't let them bring us back permanently. We'll never be free." I made it to my car, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine was dead, and when I looked under the hood, I saw that all the wires had been melted by intense heat. The burned adults were getting closer, moving with that same unnaturally slow gait, leaving smoldering footprints in the snow. That's when I noticed the insurance claim forms scattered across my passenger seat. 20 forms, all filled out in that childish handwriting I'd seen before. But now I could read what they actually said. They weren't claims for life insurance. They were requests for termination of coverage. Each form was a desperate plea from one of the surviving children, begging to be released from policies that had been keeping them bound to this place. The children had been trying to use the insurance system to break the ritual. They'd been filing claims not to collect money, but to officially declare the policies null and void, to sever the financial and legal ties that were keeping them connected to their dead families. I grabbed the forms and ran toward the community center. If the children were right, if the ritual required an authority figure to complete it, then maybe I could use that authority to break it instead. The burned adults followed me, moving faster now, their bodies beginning to glow like embers. The air around them shimmered with heat waves, and I could smell burning flesh and melting plastic. Inside the community center, I found what I was looking for. An old desk with official town letterhead and a notary seal. My hands shaking, I began stamping the claim forms, officially approving each request for policy termination. With each stamp, one of the ghostly children flickered and became more solid, more real. "What are you doing?" Mary's voice was right behind me, filled with rage and desperation. "My job," I said, continuing to stamp the forms. "Processing claims. Releasing people from policies they no longer need." The burned adults rushed toward me, but with each form I completed, their power seemed to diminish. The children were becoming stronger, more present, while their dead families grew fainter and more translucent. I finished the last form just as Mary's burning hands reached for me. There was a sound like a massive sigh, and suddenly the adults were gone. Not disappeared, transformed. They became what they should have been all along, smoke and ash and memory, finally able to rest. But the children remained. 20 young faces, no longer showing signs of fire damage, looking at me with expressions of profound relief. "Thank you," said the girl with pigtails, who now looked like any normal 8-year-old. "We can go home now. Our real homes." "What about your families?" I asked. "They're at peace now," said the small boy. "They can't hurt us anymore, can't hold on to us anymore. The ritual is broken." One by one, the children began to fade, not into nothing, but into something else, something that looked like peace. They were returning to their adult lives, finally free from the trauma that had been keeping them bound to this place. The last to go was the girl with pigtails. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "your father isn't here. He never was. That thing you might see, that thing that might try to talk to you, that's not him. That's just your grief trying to trap you, the same way theirs trapped us. Don't let it." And then she was gone, and I was alone in the community center of a town that was rapidly becoming nothing but charred ruins and foundations. I walked back to where my car had been parked, but found only the twisted metal frame of a vehicle that had been destroyed by fire years ago. The road I'd driven in on was overgrown with weeds and barely passable. The insurance claim forms in my hand had become ash. I had to walk 12 miles through mountain wilderness to reach the main highway, where I finally got cell service and called for help. When the state police came to pick me up, they were skeptical of my story about visiting Ashwood Falls. According to their records, the access road had been closed for over 20 years due to unstable ground conditions. But they did find something interesting when they investigated. In a safety deposit box at a bank in Richmond, they discovered 20 sealed envelopes that had been placed there just days after the 1995 fire. Each envelope contained a life insurance policy that had never been claimed, along with a handwritten note in a child's careful cursive, "Please don't make us come back." The bank records showed that the safety deposit box had been paid for by an anonymous trust fund that had finally run out of money in November 2024. That's when the policies had automatically been submitted to the insurance company's system, triggering the claims that brought me to Ashwood Falls. I never did find out what happened to the 20 survivors after that night. The addresses on their original adoption records were all outdated, and attempts to track them down through social services hit dead ends. But sometimes I get letters, not mailed to my office, but left on my car windshield or slipped under my apartment door. The letters are always the same. "Thank you for letting us go home. Thank you for setting us free. I still work as an insurance adjuster, but I specialize now in cases involving traumatic loss. I've learned to recognize the signs of grief that's turned toxic, love that's become a prison. And I've learned that sometimes the most important claims to approve are the ones that release people from obligations they should never have had to bear." I never saw my father during my time in Ashwood Falls, despite what the children had warned me about. But for months afterward, I would sometimes hear his voice calling my name when I was alone. Not comforting words, but desperate pleas for me to come back, to return to that place where grief could become eternal. I learned to ignore those calls, to understand them for what they were. Not love, but the hunger of loss that doesn't want to heal. Because that's what I learned in Ashwood Falls. Sometimes love becomes so twisted by trauma and desperation that it stops being love at all. It becomes something else, something that feeds on pain and grows stronger with each person it consumes. The real horror wasn't the burned adults or the ghostly children or the town that shouldn't exist. The real horror was the realization that love, when it refuses to let go, can become the most monstrous thing of all. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind sounds like distant voices, I still hear them calling, not just my father, but all the others. Every person I've ever lost, every family member whose claim I've processed, every soul that grief has tried to chain to this world. They're calling my name, promising reunion, offering the same terrible bargain that trapped the families of Ashwood Falls. The difference is, now I know better than to answer. But the calls are getting stronger, and someday, I'm afraid I might not be strong enough to resist. After all, we all have to go home eventually. The question is, whether we choose our destination, or whether it chooses us. My name's Sarah Mitchell, and I've been driving delivery routes for UPS for almost 8 years now. Started right after my divorce, when I needed something steady that would let me support my daughter Emma and help out my folks back in Asheville. The job's not glamorous, but it pays decent, and I've always been good with directions and dealing with people. Most days, I work the suburban routes around town, subdivisions where the biggest challenge is finding house numbers or avoiding someone's overly friendly golden retriever. But that December, everything changed when I got assigned to cover the mountain routes for a driver who'd called out sick. I should have known something was off when my supervisor Jake handed me the route sheet for Hollowbrook. He kept avoiding eye contact, mumbling something about just get in and get out, and how the regular driver, Mike, had been acting strange lately before he went out on medical leave. The route covered this tiny mountain community about 2 hours northeast of Asheville, population maybe 400 people, according to the outdated map in my truck. Jake mentioned the cell service was spotty up there, and that if I ran into any trouble, there was supposedly a landline at the town clerk's office. He also warned me about the weather. There was a big storm system moving in, and if I didn't finish the deliveries by Christmas Eve, those people might not see their packages until after New Year's. The drive up there was beautiful, in that lonely way the Appalachian mountains can be in winter. Winding 2-lane roads carved into hillsides, bare trees creating these intricate patterns against the gray December sky. I'd driven plenty of rural routes before, but nothing quite this remote. The farther I got from the main highway, the fewer houses I saw, until eventually it was just forest on both sides of the road for miles at a stretch. When I finally reached the turnoff for Hollowbrook, there wasn't even a proper sign. Just a weathered piece of wood with the town name carved into it, hanging crooked from a rusted post. The town itself sat in a narrow valley between two ridges, maybe 20 or 30 buildings clustered around a single main street that dead-ended at what looked like an old lumber mill. Most of the houses were small and run down, the kind of place where people made do with what they had and didn't ask for much from the outside world. I parked at what I assumed was the town hall, a brick building that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1942, and went inside to introduce myself. The woman behind the desk was probably in her 60s, thin as a rail with graying hair pulled back tight. She looked up when I walked in, and for just a second, I could have sworn her eyes lit up in a way that didn't match her reserved mountain politeness. She introduced herself as Carol Hensley, the town clerk, and seemed almost too eager to help me figure out the delivery addresses. She insisted on walking me through the route personally, pointing out shortcuts and warning me about which roads might ice over if the temperature dropped. The only thing that struck me as odd was when she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I should try to finish up before dark and stick to the main roads. That first day went smoothly enough. The people in Hollowbrook were friendly in that careful way rural folks can be with outsiders. Polite but reserved, watching to see what kind of person you were before deciding whether to trust you. Almost everyone invited me in for coffee or to warm up, which was nice given how cold it was getting. What struck me as unusual was how many packages they were getting. For such a small, isolated community, there were an awful lot of deliveries, heavy boxes that clinked when I moved them, most shipped overnight or express from places like Richmond and Charlotte. When I mentioned it to one of the recipients, an elderly man named Earl who lived in a cabin near the edge of town, he just smiled and said they tried to stock up for winter. I noticed other small things too. Every house I visited smelled like cooking meat. Not unusual for dinner time, except it was the middle of the afternoon. Several people had unusually sharp-looking teeth, which I figured was just poor dental care in a place this remote. And I didn't see any pets, livestock, or even wild animals, which seemed strange for such a rural area. When I mentioned it to Carol at the end of the day, she said something about how the harsh winters had driven most of the animals deeper into the mountains. The second day started the same way, but I began paying closer attention to things that had seemed innocent the day before. The packages I was delivering all had a similar smell, metallic and sweet, like raw meat that had been sitting out too long. When I picked up one box that had torn slightly during shipping, I could see what looked like vacuum-sealed plastic inside, dark red contents that I tried not to think too hard about. I told myself it was probably venison or other game meat, shipped in from hunting relatives or something. Mountain people were known for their hunting and self-sufficiency. But then I started noticing the return addresses. A surprising number of packages were coming from funeral homes, medical facilities, and what appeared to be morgues in various cities across the southeast. That seemed like a strange coincidence, but I couldn't think of any reasonable explanation that made sense. When I asked Earl about it, while delivering another heavy, cold package to his place, his expression went blank for just a moment before he smiled again and invited me in for lunch. His kitchen was warm and welcoming, with something savory simmering on the stove that smelled incredible. I was hungry, and the food looked good, some kind of stew with chunks of tender meat and rich broth. Earl was an excellent cook, and we had a pleasant conversation about the weather and how the town had changed over the years. It was only when I was getting ready to leave that I realized I hadn't seen him eat any vegetables or bread with the meal, just meat and broth. When I mentioned it, he said his doctor had put him on a special diet. That afternoon, I made a disturbing discovery while delivering a package to a house on the outskirts of town. I'd walked around back to find the homeowner when I noticed a pile of bones behind the house, partially hidden by a tarp. At first glance, they looked like typical animal bones, the kind you'd expect to find around any rural home where people butchered their own meat. But something about the size and shape bothered me. Some of those bones looked too long, too straight to be from deer or livestock, and mixed in with them were what appeared to be pieces of clothing and personal items, a wristwatch, a wallet, things that definitely didn't belong with animal remains. I tried to tell myself I was letting my imagination run wild, but the feeling of unease that had been building for 2 days was getting harder to ignore. When I tried to call Jake from my cell phone to check in, I discovered I had no signal, not even one bar. I drove to the town hall to use the landline Carol had mentioned, but she informed me apologetically that the phone system had gone down that morning. Some problem with the lines further down the mountain. That evening, as I was loading up my truck for the final day of deliveries, I noticed several people watching me from their windows and porches. Not in a friendly way, more like they were studying me, evaluating something. When I waved at a group of men standing near the old mill, they didn't wave back. They just kept staring until I drove away. I spent that night in my truck parked near the town hall, too uneasy to accept any of the offers of hospitality I'd received. The third day, December 23rd, was when everything fell apart. I arrived in town to find the atmosphere completely changed. People who had been friendly and welcoming now watched me with undisguised hunger in their eyes. Several residents followed my truck as I made deliveries, always staying just far enough away to maintain plausible deniability but close enough to make their presence known. When I tried to start my truck after lunch, the engine wouldn't turn over. Earl appeared almost immediately, offering to take a look under the hood. He said it looked like someone had tampered with the fuel line, but not to worry, they'd have it fixed by morning. I didn't believe him for a second. The way he smiled when he said it, showing those sharp-filed teeth, made my skin crawl. I thanked him politely and said I'd wait in the truck, but he insisted I come stay at his place for the night. When I declined, he mentioned that the temperature was supposed to drop below freezing, and it wouldn't be safe to sleep in the vehicle. Other residents began gathering around, all offering their hospitality with the same predatory gleam in their eyes. That's when I noticed the bones weren't just behind Earl's house. Every property I looked at carefully had similar piles of remains, all partially hidden but visible if you knew what to look for. And some of those bones were definitely human. I recognized a skull mixed in with what was supposed to be deer ribs behind the town hall. The packages I'd been delivering weren't game meat. They were human remains, shipped in from morgues and funeral homes by people who had been corrupted or coerced into providing bodies to this isolated community. I realized with growing horror that Hollowbrook wasn't just a remote mountain town that had turned to cannibalism out of desperation. This was an organized operation. They used their location and reputation as a dying mountain community to avoid outside attention while systematically obtaining human flesh through a network of corrupted funeral industry professionals. And delivery drivers like me weren't just bringing supplies, we were potential additions to their food supply. As the sun started setting, the temperature plummeted, and the first snowflakes began falling. The storm system Jake had warned me about was arriving ahead of schedule. I could see lights coming on in houses around town and dark figures moving between buildings in what looked like coordinated patterns. They weren't even pretending to be normal anymore. Carol approached my truck with several other residents, all of them moving with a strange, predatory gait I hadn't noticed before. She tapped on my window and explained that they'd found the problem with my truck. It would need parts that wouldn't arrive until after Christmas. But not to worry, they'd take good care of me until then. The way she said take care of me made it clear she wasn't talking about hospitality. When I politely declined and said I'd called for a tow truck, she pointed out that the phone lines were still down and my cell phone wouldn't work in the mountains. I was trapped, and they wanted me to know it. I waited until full dark, then slipped out of my truck and made my way to the edge of town on foot. I'd noticed an old logging road that might connect to the main highway, and I figured my best chance was to hike out in the darkness while they assumed I was still sleeping in my vehicle. But I'd underestimated how well they knew their territory. Within an hour, I could hear them calling to each other through the woods, not shouting, but making these low, guttural sounds that barely sounded human. They were hunting me like a pack of wolves. The next several hours were the longest of my life. They seemed to know every deer path and hiding spot in those mountains, and they were patient in a way that suggested they'd done this before. Several times I thought I'd lost them, only to hear that awful calling sound from a direction I hadn't expected. They were herding me, trying to drive me back toward town or into some kind of trap. The snow was falling heavily now, making it even harder to navigate and covering my tracks, but also covering theirs. Around midnight, I managed to reach what I thought was the logging road, but it turned out to be just another dead end deep in the forest. I was exhausted, freezing, and starting to panic when I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. Multiple people, moving carefully but getting closer. I found a hiding spot behind a fallen tree and tried to stay silent, but I could hear them spreading out around my position. Earl's voice drifted through the darkness, calm and patient. "Sarah, you're going to freeze out here. Come back with us. We'll take good care of you." I knew what good care meant. I'd seen the bones. I'd delivered the packages. I knew what they did to people who couldn't escape. So when Earl appeared around the end of the fallen tree, moving slowly with his hands visible like he was approaching a frightened animal, I didn't hesitate. I hit him with a heavy branch as hard as I could and ran deeper into the woods while the others rushed to help him. That bought me maybe an hour, but I knew I couldn't outrun them indefinitely in terrain they knew better than anyone. My only advantage was that they wanted me alive and relatively undamaged. Dead meat wasn't as good as fresh meat, and injuries would spoil the flavor. That gave me a small window to take risks they couldn't afford to take. I remembered seeing a communications tower on one of the ridges during my drive into town. If I could reach it, there might be equipment I could use to call for help. It meant climbing straight up the mountainside in a blizzard, but staying on the ground meant certain death. The climb nearly killed me. I slipped and fell multiple times, tore my clothes on rocks and brambles, and came close to hypothermia. But desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had. The tower was abandoned, but there was a maintenance shack with an emergency radio. It took me 3 tries to get it working, but finally I managed to raise a state police dispatcher. I gave them my location and tried to explain the situation, though I knew how insane it sounded. Cannibals in an Appalachian town using UPS deliveries to obtain human remains. The dispatcher was professional, but skeptical until I mentioned finding human bones and gave them specific addresses. I spent the rest of the night in that maintenance shack, listening to the search party calling for me in the valley below. As the sun came up, I could see them clearly for the first time. Maybe 20 people spread out through the woods, all unnaturally thin despite obviously eating well, all moving with that predatory coordination I'd noticed. They looked more like a pack of wild animals than human beings. The state police arrived around noon, approaching carefully with backup from the sheriff's department and even some federal agents. I guided them to the locations where I'd seen the bone piles and helped them understand what I'd observed about the delivery operation. The investigation that followed confirmed everything I'd suspected, and worse. Hollowbrook had been operating as a cannibalistic community for at least 15 years, using corrupted funeral home employees to provide bodies and targeting delivery drivers, hunters, and other isolated visitors as supplementary food sources. Most of the residents disappeared into the mountains before the authorities could arrest them, and the few who were caught claimed they'd been forced to participate out of fear. The federal investigation uncovered a network of funeral homes and morgues across multiple states that had been selling bodies to the community, but prosecuting everyone involved took years, and most of the sentences were lighter than they should have been. I quit UPS immediately and moved back closer to my family in Asheville. I still have nightmares about those 3 days, especially about Earl's patient voice calling to me through the snowfall. Emma knows something bad happened during my last delivery route, but I've never told her the details. Some things are too dark to pass on to your children. I work in an office now, doing data entry for an insurance company. The pay isn't as good, but I never have to deliver packages to remote locations or trust strangers who offer too much hospitality. Looking back, I still can't believe how close I came to ending up as meat in someone's freezer. The thing that bothers me most isn't even what they were doing. It's how normal they seemed at first. How easy it was to accept their hospitality and ignore the warning signs until it was almost too late. I think about Mike, the regular driver who'd been acting strange before he went on medical leave. I never found out what happened to him, and I'm not sure I want to know. These days, I stick to well-populated areas and always let someone know exactly where I'm going when I travel. I've become one of those people who researches small towns before visiting them, looking for any signs of the kind of isolation and desperation that can turn neighbors into predators. The mountains are still beautiful, but I don't trust them anymore. Beauty can hide terrible things, and hospitality can mask the worst kind of hunger. I'm Marcus Johnson, and I've been fixing heating and air conditioning systems for 15 years now. Started right out of high school, when my dad's buddy got me an apprenticeship with a local HVAC company in Richmond. These days I run my own operation, mostly contract work, emergency calls, the kind of jobs that take you all over Virginia and sometimes beyond. It's honest work, and after my divorce 3 years ago, staying busy has been good for me. Keeps my mind off things, you know? Plus, the money's decent, especially during the winter months when everyone's furnace decides to quit at the worst possible time. That's exactly what happened in December of 2019. I was getting ready to take a few days off for Christmas when I got a call from a dispatcher I'd never worked with before. Said they had an emergency situation up in Millerville, some little town I'd never heard of, about 2 hours north of Richmond. Apparently their entire heating grid had failed right before a major cold snap was supposed to hit. 800 people, and not a single working furnace in the whole town. The pay was good, really good. Triple my usual emergency rate, plus they'd cover my hotel and meals. The dispatcher said they'd tried 3 other contractors already, but nobody could figure out what was wrong. All the systems were relatively new, installed within the past 5 years by different companies, but they were all failing in the same way. That should have been my first red flag right there. In 15 years of doing this work, I'd never heard of anything like that. But I needed the money, and honestly, I was curious. I've always prided myself on being able to diagnose problems other techs can't figure out. Got a reputation for it. My ex-wife used to joke that I was more comfortable troubleshooting a broken furnace than dealing with people, and she probably wasn't wrong. Machines make sense to me. They follow rules. When something's broken, there's always a logical reason why. I packed up my van with extra tools and diagnostic equipment, threw in some warm clothes, and headed north. The drive took me through increasingly rural countryside, past farms and forests that looked like something out of a Christmas card. Snow had already started falling by the time I reached the turnoff for Millerville, and the temperature was dropping fast. The town itself was smaller than I'd expected. Main Street was maybe 6 blocks long, with a few shops, a diner, a gas station, and what looked like a small grocery store. Most of the houses were older, probably built in the 1940s and 50s, but well-maintained. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and strangers stick out like a sore thumb. I checked into the Millerville Inn, which was really just a converted Victorian house with 4 guest rooms above a small restaurant. The woman at the front desk, Mrs. Hartley, was friendly enough. But there was something about her that struck me as odd. She barely looked at me when she handed over the key, and when I mentioned I was there to fix the heating problems, she just nodded and said, "Yes, we've been expecting you." Not, "Thank God you're here," or "We really appreciate you coming out." Just, "We've been expecting you," like I was showing up for a routine appointment instead of an emergency call in the middle of a potential blizzard. My room was on the 2nd floor, and it was freezing. I could see my breath when I exhaled. Mrs. Hartley had apologized, saying their heating system was down like everyone else's, but she'd brought me extra blankets. I spent that first evening going over the work orders and system specifications, trying to get a handle on what I was dealing with. The more I read, the more confused I got. The reports from the previous contractors were all over the place. Some said the heat exchangers were corroded beyond repair. Others blamed faulty control boards. One guy had written extensive biological contamination throughout ductwork and left it at that. Biological contamination in a heating system? That didn't make any sense. I called the number the dispatcher had given me to check in, but it just rang and rang. No voicemail, nothing. Tried calling my regular contact back in Richmond, but couldn't get a signal. Cell service was spotty up here, which wasn't unusual for rural areas, but it was frustrating. The next morning, I started my inspections at the house closest to the inn. The homeowner, Mr. Peterson, met me at the door. He was probably in his 60s, wearing multiple layers of clothing but didn't seem particularly bothered by the cold. "You must be the heating man," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Basement's this way." What struck me immediately was how calm he was. His house was maybe 40 degrees inside, cold enough that I could see my breath, but he was acting like it was a minor inconvenience. Most people would be panicking, especially with the weather forecast calling for temperatures in the teens. The basement was even stranger. Peterson led me down without turning on a light, navigating the stairs perfectly in near total darkness. I had to use my flashlight to see where I was going. When I pointed it at him, I noticed he was watching me instead of looking where he was walking, like he already knew exactly where everything was. The furnace itself was a newer model, maybe 3 years old. Should have been running fine. But when I opened the access panel, I immediately knew something was seriously wrong. The heat exchanger looked like it had been eaten away by acid. Metal components that should have lasted decades were corroded through in spots, and there was this strange, organic-looking residue coating everything. "When did you first notice problems with the heating?" I asked Peterson. "About 2 weeks ago," he replied. "Same time as everyone else." I looked at him. Everyone else started having problems at exactly the same time? More or less. He was standing unnaturally still, hands at his sides, watching me work. "We adapt." That word adapt stuck with me. Not "we're managing" or "we're coping." We adapt. Like the cold was something they were getting used to rather than fighting against. I spent the next few hours checking 5 more houses, and the pattern was identical. Every furnace showed the same type of corrosion, the same organic residue, the same component failures. More disturbing was the behavior of the residents. They were all unusually calm about the situation, and they all seemed to move and speak in similar ways. Small things, but noticeable. The way they all stood with their hands at their sides when talking to me. The way they all used very similar phrases. "We adapt." "We're managing fine." "It's not a problem." By the 3rd house, I was starting to feel like I was talking to the same person in different bodies. The organic residue was bothering me most. I scraped some samples into plastic bags, figuring I'd send them to a lab when I got back to Richmond. Under my flashlight, the stuff looked almost fungal, stringy and fibrous, with a slightly greenish tint. It smelled musty, like old mushrooms or wet leaves. But the really weird thing was that it seemed to be growing. In the 1st house, I'd noticed small patches of it on the heat exchanger and a few connecting pipes. By the 4th house, I was finding it throughout the entire ductwork system, spreading into the walls and even up into the main floor vents. I tried calling the dispatcher again that evening, but still couldn't get through. The inn's landline wasn't working either. Mrs. Hartley said the phone company was working on it, but didn't seem concerned about when it might be fixed. That night, lying in bed under 4 blankets, I started hearing sounds from the other rooms. Not loud, just soft shuffling, like people moving around. But when I checked my watch, it was 3 in the morning. Who moves around at 3 in the morning? And the sounds were too regular, too rhythmic, like people pacing in unison. I got up and looked out my window, which faced Main Street. There were lights on in houses all over town, and I could see figures moving behind the windows. Not rushing around like you'd expect from people dealing with a heating emergency, but slow, deliberate movement. And they all seemed to be moving in the same direction at the same time, like they were following some kind of schedule. The next morning, I decided to check the municipal building to see if there were any blueprints or system diagrams that might help me understand how all these heating failures were connected. The building was old but well maintained, with a small office for the town clerk and what looked like a meeting room. The clerk, a woman named Sarah Mills, was helpful but gave me the same unsettling feeling as everyone else. She produced the blueprints I needed without hesitation, almost like she'd been expecting me to ask for them. Studying the diagrams, I realized that many of the houses in Millerville were connected by an old tunnel system that had been built during the Cold War. some kind of civil defense shelter network. The tunnels ran beneath most of the downtown area and connected to the basements of at least 30 houses. "Are these tunnels still accessible?" I asked Sarah. "Oh yes," she said. "We use them for storage, maintenance access, very convenient for working on utilities." She offered to show me the entrance, which was located behind the municipal building. The tunnel entrance was a heavy metal door set into a concrete retaining wall, secured with a padlock. Sarah produced the key without being asked. "The main tunnel runs about half a mile," she explained as she unlocked the door. "Connects to most of the residential areas. You'll find access points in many of the basements you've already visited." The tunnel was larger than I'd expected, about 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, with concrete walls and a poured concrete floor. Battery-powered emergency lights were spaced every 30 feet or so, providing dim illumination. The air was stale and humid, with that same musty smell I'd been detecting in the furnaces. 20 feet into the tunnel, I found the source. The walls and ceiling were covered with the same organic growth I'd been finding in the heating systems, but much more extensive. It looked like some kind of fungus or mold, growing in thick, web-like patterns that covered nearly every surface. In some places, it hung down in long, fibrous strands that brushed against my hair as I walked. More disturbing, the growth seemed to be responding to my presence. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, I could see ripples of movement spreading through the fungal network, like signals being transmitted from one section to another. The whole thing was connected, and it was definitely alive. I followed the main tunnel for about a quarter mile, documenting everything with my camera and taking more samples. Side passages branched off toward different residential areas, and each branch showed the same extensive fungal contamination. But this wasn't random growth, it was organized, purposeful. The fungus had grown into the heating ducts, through wall cavities, and up into the living spaces above. Near the end of the main tunnel, I found something that made my blood run cold. A section of the wall had been partially excavated, revealing a large chamber beyond. The chamber was filled with what looked like cocoons or pods, dozens of them, hanging from the ceiling like oversized sleeping bags, and they were warm. Even with the outside temperature near freezing, the chamber was probably 70 degrees. I was backing away from this discovery when I heard voices behind me. Multiple people talking in low, synchronized voices. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, listening. The voices were getting closer, and they were all saying the same thing in perfect unison. Adaptation is necessary. Integration is beneficial. Resistance is inefficient. I waited in the darkness as footsteps passed by my hiding spot. At least a dozen people, walking in perfect lockstep. When their voices faded, I turned my flashlight back on and ran for the tunnel entrance. Sarah Mills was waiting for me when I emerged, standing exactly where I'd left her 45 minutes earlier. She hadn't moved. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Yeah, I managed. I think there's some kind of contamination down there, biological, might be affecting the heating systems." "Yes," she said. "The collective needs optimal environmental conditions for reproductive success. The heating systems were interfering." The way she said collective made my skin crawl. Not like she was referring to the town council or some kind of community organization, like she was talking about a single entity. "I need to make some phone calls," I told her. "Contact the health department. Maybe the CDC." "That won't be necessary," Sarah said. "The adaptation process is already underway. Your integration will be simple and beneficial." I started backing toward my van. "What do you mean, integration?" "You've been breathing the spores for 2 days now," she explained, still speaking in that eerily calm tone. "The process has already begun. You'll understand soon." That's when I noticed other people emerging from buildings along Main Street. They were all walking toward us with the same measured pace, the same synchronized movements I'd been observing. And they were all staring at me with the same expression, not hostile, but intensely focused, like predators watching prey. I ran for my van, fumbling for the keys. Behind me, I could hear them starting to chant again. Adaptation is necessary. Integration is beneficial. Resistance is inefficient. The van started on the first try, and I peeled out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the street, watching me go. Not chasing, not running, just watching. I drove for 2 hours straight before I stopped at a gas station to call for help. But when I tried to explain what I'd found to the state police, the health department, even the FBI, nobody seemed to take me seriously. A fungal infection that controls human behavior? Coordinated mass hysteria in a small town? It sounded crazy, even to me. The weirdest part was that when I tried to show them the photos I'd taken in the tunnel, they were all corrupted. Every single file was damaged, showing nothing but digital noise. The sample bags I'd collected were empty, not just empty, but clean, like they'd never contained anything at all. 3 days later, I saw a news report about Millerville. Tragic heating system failure during a severe winter storm had killed most of the town's population, only a handful of survivors. The reporter mentioned that the few who had survived were suffering from severe hypothermia and respiratory infections, but were expected to recover. I tried to contact the survivors, but the hospital wouldn't give me any information. When I drove back up there a week later, the town was sealed off by state and federal authorities. Hazmat teams were burning buildings and digging up huge sections of the tunnel system. That was 6 years ago. I still work in HVAC, but I've never taken another emergency call in a small town. I've also never found any trace of what happened to the samples I collected, the photos I took, or any official record of what was really found in Millerville. Sometimes, though, late at night when I'm working alone in a basement or crawl space, I catch a whiff of that musty smell, and I have to resist the urge to follow it to its source. Because part of me, a part that's been growing stronger over the years, is curious about what I might find there. What bothers me most is that the curiosity doesn't feel entirely like my own. My name's Jennifer Walsh, and I've been installing cable and internet for going on 8 years now. Started right out of community college when I couldn't afford to keep going for my computer science degree. Figured I'd do it for a year, maybe 2, save up some money, and get back to school. But the work was steady, the pay was decent, and honestly, I was good at it. Really good. I could run fiber through places other techs said were impossible, troubleshoot signal issues that had stumped guys with 20 years experience, and I wasn't afraid to crawl under houses or climb up in attics that most people wouldn't go near. By December of 2019, I was working as an independent contractor mostly, taking the jobs the big companies didn't want to mess with. Rural installations, problem houses, places where 3 other techs had already failed. I was living in Charlotte then, sharing an apartment with my ex-boyfriend Marcus until we finally called it quits in November. Nothing dramatic, we just grew apart. I was working more, he was drinking more, and eventually we both admitted it wasn't going anywhere. So I was on my own, picking up extra jobs to afford my own place after the holidays, when this government contract came across my desk. Cedar Valley. Population 500, up in the mountains about 2 hours north of Asheville. The federal government was funding a rural internet initiative, trying to get high-speed connectivity to these little mountain towns before the end of the year. Some kind of infrastructure spending that had to be completed by December 31st or they'd lose the funding. Cedar Valley had never had reliable internet. Hell, they barely had reliable phone service. The whole town was in this weird dead zone where cell towers couldn't reach, and the mountains interfered with satellite signals. The pay was incredible. Triple my usual rate, plus travel expenses, and a completion bonus if I could get the whole town online before Christmas. The catch was, I'd have to stay up there for the full installation. Probably 2 weeks, maybe 3, living in a motel in the nearest bigger town about 40 minutes away. But I needed the money, and honestly, I was looking forward to getting out of Charlotte for a while. The mountains in winter, some peace and quiet, time to think about what I wanted to do next. It seemed perfect. I should have known better. In 8 years of running cables, I'd learned that the jobs that seemed too good to be true usually were. I drove up to Cedar Valley on a Monday morning in early December, my van loaded with fiber optic cable, signal boosters, and enough networking equipment to wire a small city. The government specs for this job were weird. Way more monitoring equipment than a town that size needed, redundant systems, and some components I'd never seen before. When I called my contact at the federal office to ask about it, they just said to install everything according to the diagrams. National security infrastructure, they said. Rural emergency communications. Cedar Valley sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of mountains, connected to the outside world by one winding 2-lane road that followed a creek down through the hollows. The town itself was maybe 6 blocks long and 3 blocks wide. A post office, a gas station with a little market, a diner, a handful of churches, and houses scattered up the hillsides. Most of the houses were old, built in the 1942 and 52, though some looked even older. The people were friendly enough, but reserved, the way mountain folks often are with outsiders. They seemed genuinely excited about getting real internet, though. Kids especially kept asking when they'd be able to stream videos and play games online. The first week went smooth. I started with the main infrastructure, running fiber optic cable along the power lines, installing signal boosters, setting up the central hub in the basement of the post office. The town's electrical grid was old but solid, and there were enough existing utility easements that I didn't have to dig much new cable. The government had provided detailed maps of the town, including layouts of houses I hadn't even been inside yet. When I mentioned this to Carol at the post office, she just shrugged. Government probably got them from the county assessor, she said, but some things felt off from the start. The monitoring equipment I was installing was way more sophisticated than anything I'd worked with. Cameras with thermal imaging, sensors that detected electromagnetic fields, data collection units that seemed designed to monitor internet traffic down to the individual keystroke. When I called my federal contact to double-check the specs, they assured me it was all standard for rural infrastructure projects. Homeland security requirements, they said, making sure the network can't be compromised. The strangest part was that some of this equipment was already there. On Thursday of the first week, I was running cable through the crawl space under Mrs. Henderson's house when I found a network hub that wasn't on any of my diagrams. It was connected to cables that ran back toward the center of town, but it also had lines running out toward the mountains. When I followed one of the cables, it led to a small antenna dish hidden in the trees behind her house. The dish was pointing up at an angle that wouldn't hit any communication satellites I knew about. It was pointing at empty sky. I took pictures and called my contact. They told me to leave the existing equipment alone and just integrate my installation with it. Previous survey work, they explained. Don't worry about it, but I was starting to worry. In 8 years of installation work, I'd never seen government contractors leave expensive monitoring equipment in place without documentation. And I'd definitely never seen equipment that advanced in a town that didn't even have basic internet service. Friday, I started noticing problems with my own equipment. My tablet kept losing GPS signal, even in open areas where it should have been fine. My cell phone would show full bars 1 minute and no service the next, sometimes in the exact same spot. The diagnostic equipment I used to test signal strength kept giving readings that didn't make sense, showing massive amounts of data traffic in a town where half the houses didn't even have computers. That weekend, I drove back to Charlotte to pick up more equipment and clear my head. But sitting in my empty apartment, looking at the photos I'd taken of the mysterious equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong in Cedar Valley. I spent Sunday evening researching the companies listed on the equipment labels. Most of them came back to defense contractors and aerospace firms. One of them, according to what I could find online, had been involved in SETI projects, looking for signals from space. I called my federal contact first thing Monday morning, but the number went straight to a voicemail that said the office was temporarily closed. When I tried the backup number they'd given me, a woman answered who said she'd never heard of the Cedar Valley project. I almost didn't go back. I could have taken the loss on the contract, kept the down payment they'd given me, and found other work. But I needed that completion bonus, and honestly, my pride wouldn't let me walk away from a job half-finished. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was probably a reasonable explanation for everything. So I drove back up to Cedar Valley Monday afternoon, and that's when things really started getting weird. The first sign something was wrong was my van's radio. As soon as I crossed into the valley, every station turned to static except for one, a classical music station that came in crystal clear. But according to my radio's display, I was receiving it on a frequency that should have been empty, and the signal strength indicator was maxed out, like the transmission was coming from somewhere right in town. I parked at the motel where I'd been staying, a little place called Mountain View Motor Inn, about 40 minutes outside Cedar Valley, and tried to check my messages. My phone showed I had 7 voicemails, but when I played them back, all I got was silence. Not dead air, not static, but perfect, Absolute silence that lasted exactly 30 seconds for each message. I checked my call log, and all the incoming numbers were listed as 000, 000, 0000. Tuesday morning, I drove back to Cedar Valley to finish the residential installations. I had about 30 houses left to connect, and I wanted to get them done before the weather turned bad. The forecast was calling for snow later in the week. At the first house, old Mr. Jenkins, who lived alone with his dog, I found more equipment. This time, it was in his attic, connected to the electrical system and hidden behind insulation. It looked like some kind of receiver or transmitter, with cables leading to an antenna I couldn't locate. When I asked Mr. Jenkins about it, he swore he'd never seen it before. Said he hadn't been up in his attic in years because of his bad knees. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The equipment was old. Not just old, but covered with dust and spider webs like it had been there for years. But that was impossible. Mr. Jenkins' house had been inspected by the power company just 6 months ago when he had electrical problems. They would have noticed professional networking equipment in his attic. I started checking the other houses more carefully. By the end of Tuesday, I'd found similar equipment in 8 different houses. Always hidden, always looking like it had been there for years, and always connected to antennas pointing up at that same angle toward empty sky. Wednesday morning, I drove up to the ridge above town to see if I could figure out what the antennas were pointing at. The road up there was barely maintained, more like a logging trail, but my van could handle it. About halfway up, I found a clearing where I had a good view of the whole valley. Cedar Valley looked different from up there, not just smaller, but wrong somehow. The layout of the streets didn't quite match my maps. There were houses I couldn't see from down in the valley, and some of the buildings that looked old from street level were clearly new construction when seen from above. The whole town looked like a movie set, like someone had built a convincing replica of a mountain town but hadn't gotten all the details right. And scattered around the ridges surrounding the valley, I could see more antenna dishes, dozens of them, all pointed up at the same angle, all nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. I took out my phone to take pictures, but the camera wouldn't work. Every photo came out as pure white, like I was pointing the camera directly into a bright light. But it was an overcast day, and there was barely any sun coming through the clouds. That's when I noticed the silence. I'd been so focused on looking at the town that I hadn't realized how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even my van's engine seemed muffled, like the sound was being absorbed by something. I tried starting the engine to leave, and it cranked but wouldn't turn over. I was stranded on the ridge, in perfect silence, looking down at a town that might not be what I thought it was. Then my phone rang. The caller ID said Jennifer Walsh, which was impossible since that was my name. I answered it anyway, because in that moment of perfect silence and strangeness, the impossible seemed normal. "Jennifer," the voice said, and it sounded exactly like my own voice. "We need to talk." "Who is this?" I asked, but I already knew the answer was going to be something I didn't want to hear. "We've been watching you work," my own voice said through the phone. "You're very good at what you do, very thorough. We appreciate thoroughness." "Who is we?" "The same people who hired you, the same people who've been preparing Cedar Valley for this moment. We're sorry about the deception, Jennifer, but it was necessary. We needed someone with your skills, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions until it was too late." I hung up and immediately tried to call 911. But instead of a dispatcher, I got the same voice, my own voice, saying, "We're not finished talking." "Jennifer." I turned off the phone and threw it on the passenger seat. That's when I noticed that my van's radio had turned itself on. Classical music was playing, the same station I'd been hearing since Monday, but now I could hear something underneath the music. Voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, having what sounded like a conversation. My van started on the first try. I drove down from the ridge faster than I should have, sliding around the curves on the gravel road, desperate to get back to something that felt normal. But when I reached the bottom and turned toward town, Cedar Valley had changed again. There were more houses now, streets that hadn't existed that morning, and people walking around who I'd never seen before, despite spending a week and a half connecting internet service to every residence in town. These new people looked normal enough, but they all turned to watch me as I drove past. Not curious looks, not friendly waves, but focused attention, like they were studying me. I parked at the post office and went inside to find Carol. She was behind the counter like always, sorting mail, but when she looked up at me, her eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, not dilated, black like deep water, with no visible iris or pupil. "Afternoon, Jennifer," she said in a perfectly normal voice. "How's the installation going?" I backed toward the door, but it had locked behind me. "The equipment you've been installing," Carol said, still sorting mail with her impossible black eyes, "it's working perfectly, better than we hoped. You should be proud." "What's happening here?" I managed to ask. "We're studying you," she said. "All of you. Humanity is interesting. Your communication patterns, your social structures, your response to surveillance and control. Cedar Valley is one of our observation sites. The equipment you've installed will let us monitor human behavior more efficiently." "You're not human." "No," she agreed. "We're from somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to here. We've been watching your species for a long time, trying to decide if you're worth preserving. The internet you've been so eager to bring to isolated places like this, it's made our work much easier. Every device you connect gives us more access to your thoughts and behaviors." The mail she was sorting wasn't mail, it was photographs. Hundreds of photographs of me driving into town that first day, me working under houses, me sleeping in the motel, me on the phone with Marcus last month, me as a child playing in my grandmother's backyard 20 years ago. "We've been watching you specifically for quite some time, Jennifer. You have a talent for making connections, for bringing communication to places that were previously isolated. That skill is valuable to us. What do you want?" "We want you to keep working. There are other towns, other isolated communities that need internet service. We'll provide the contracts, the equipment, the generous payment. All you have to do is install what we give you and ask no questions." "And if I refuse?" Carol's black eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like mirrors. "Cedar Valley has a population of 500. None of them were real, Jennifer. We created them for this interaction with you. But other towns, other projects, those people are real. Whether they continue to exist depends on how useful humanity proves to be." The door unlocked behind me with a loud click. "Think about it," Carol said. "You have until Christmas to decide." I ran to my van and drove straight through to Charlotte without stopping. I left all my equipment in Cedar Valley, abandoned the job, forfeited the down payment. I didn't care. I just wanted to be somewhere with normal people and normal problems. But it wasn't over. The next morning, I found a package outside my apartment door. Inside was a check for the full amount of the Cedar Valley contract, including the completion bonus. There was also a new phone, same model as my old one, but when I turned it on, all my contacts were there, along with my photos and text messages. At the bottom of my contact list was a new entry, current assignment. When I called the number, I heard my own voice say, "Good morning, Jennifer. Ready for your next project?" That was 5 years ago. I've completed 17 installations since then, in small towns across Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The contracts always come with generous payment and equipment I don't understand. The towns are always isolated, always in need of modern communication infrastructure. I've tried to refuse, tried to quit, tried to warn people, but every time I do, the people in the town disappear. Not killed, not relocated. They simply stop existing, like they were never born. And then I get a new phone call, a new assignment, and a reminder that my compliance keeps real people alive. I still live in Charlotte, though I travel most of the time now. I still tell people I'm an internet installer, because that's technically true. Marcus and I got back together briefly last year, but I couldn't explain the work I was really doing, couldn't tell him why I was gone for weeks at a time, why I wouldn't let him visit me on job sites. We broke up again. The thing is, I'm good at what I do. I'm really good. And every installation makes their network a little stronger, their surveillance a little more complete. I'm helping them study us, helping them decide whether humanity deserves to continue existing. Looking back, I think they chose me because they knew I wouldn't be able to walk away. I've always been the type of person who finishes what she starts, who takes pride in doing good work. They're counting on that. My phone just buzzed. New assignment, a town in eastern Kentucky that's been without reliable internet for decades. Population 1,200. All real people, with real families, real lives that depend on my cooperation. I guess I better start packing my equipment. I was 31 when I started working as an appliance repair technician in Norfolk, Virginia. It wasn't glamorous work, but after spending 3 years getting sober and trying to rebuild my life, I needed something steady that would keep me busy and help me pay off the debts I'd racked up during my drinking days. The job involved driving around to different neighborhoods, fixing washing machines, dryers, refrigerators, basically anything that plugged into a wall and had given up on life. Most of the time, it was simple stuff: clogged filters, worn belts, or connections that had come loose. Nothing that required much thinking, which was exactly what I needed while I was still figuring out how to live without a bottle in my hand. December was always my busiest time. People's appliances seemed to break down right when they needed them most for the holidays. Extra laundry from visiting family, more cooking, more dishes. Machines that had been limping along all year would finally give out under the pressure. That's how I ended up taking calls in Willowdale, this tiny town about an hour outside Norfolk with maybe 450 people spread across farmhouses and old colonial homes. The money was good because most repair companies wouldn't drive that far out for small jobs, but I needed every dollar I could get. My sponsor always said that staying busy was one of the best ways to avoid thinking about drinking, and he was right. When your hands are covered in grease and your mind is focused on electrical diagrams, it's hard to think about anything else. I'd been making regular trips to Willowdale since early November. Nice enough place, the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody, and people still waved when they passed you on the street. The houses were old but well-maintained, with big front porches and yards full of oak trees that had probably been there longer than anyone could remember. Most of my customers were older folks who'd lived there their whole lives, the kind of people who called you honey and offered you sweet tea even when it was freezing outside. The work itself was pretty routine at first. Mrs. Henderson on Maple Street had a dryer that wasn't heating, turned out to be a blown thermal fuse. Mr. Rodriguez needed his dishwasher looked at because it wasn't draining properly, just needed the filter cleaned out. Normal stuff that took maybe an hour each, and everybody was polite and paid on time. I was starting to think Willowdale might become a regular part of my route. But as December went on, I started noticing some weird patterns in the service calls. It wasn't just that a lot of appliances were breaking down, that was normal for the season. It was the way they were breaking down. Every washing machine I looked at had the same unusual wear patterns on the internal components, like they'd all been running some kind of heavy cycle for months without stopping. The dryers all had similar modifications to their electrical systems. Extra wiring that didn't match the manufacturer's specs, connected to components that shouldn't have been there. When I asked customers about it, they'd just shrug and say they didn't know anything about modifications. The refrigerators were even stranger. They were all drawing way more power than they should have been, but they weren't actually keeping food any colder. Instead, they had these additional cooling coils installed in the back, connected to sealed containers that I couldn't identify. The containers were warm to the touch and hummed with electrical activity, but none of my customers seemed to know what they were for. When I suggested removing them, people would get this blank look and tell me not to worry about it, just fix whatever was broken and leave everything else alone. What really started bothering me was how all these appliances had apparently broken on the same day, December 15th. When I asked about it, every single customer gave me the exact same story, almost word for word. Yeah, just stopped working that morning. Tried turning it on and off a few times, but nothing. Must have been one of those things. Not just similar stories, identical ones, like they'd all rehearsed the same script, and the people themselves were starting to seem off. Not rude or unfriendly, but there was something missing in the way they interacted with me and with each other. Mrs. Henderson had family photos all over her living room, but when I asked about her grandchildren, she just stared at the pictures for a long moment like she was trying to remember who they were. Mr. Rodriguez's wife would walk through the room while I was working, and they wouldn't even acknowledge each other, not even a nod or a smile. These were people who'd been married for decades, living in a small town where everyone knew everyone, but they acted like polite strangers. The kids were the worst part. I'd see them in yards or walking home from school, and they just seemed empty. No running around, no laughing, no fighting with siblings. They'd walk in straight lines, do their chores, sit quietly at kitchen tables while I worked. Their parents would talk about them like they were functioning appliances rather than children. Tommy does his homework, or Sarah helps with dishes. Never, Tommy loves baseball, or Sarah's really good at art. Just basic mechanical descriptions of what they did, not who they were. I started paying closer attention to the modified appliances, trying to figure out what all the extra equipment was actually doing. The sealed containers connected to the refrigerators were definitely some kind of storage system, but for what? The additional wiring in the washing machines created loops that seemed designed to contain something rather than wash clothes. The dryer modifications included what looked like recording equipment, microphones and speakers wired into the heating elements. It was like someone had turned every appliance in Willowdale into some kind of collection and storage device, but I couldn't figure out what they were supposed to collect. By the third week of December, I was spending more time investigating the modifications than actually repairing anything. The electrical work was sophisticated, definitely not something homeowners could have done themselves. Someone with serious technical knowledge had systematically altered every appliance in town for some specific purpose. But when I tried to ask people about who had done the work or when it had been installed, I got the same blank stares and vague responses. Nobody seemed to remember anything about their appliances being different before. That's when I started testing the equipment. I brought a digital recorder and an EMF detector, tools I'd picked up during my drinking days when I was convinced my apartment was haunted. Turns out I was just hearing my upstairs neighbors, but the equipment came in handy now. Inside every modified appliance, the EMF readings were off the charts. Not just electrical interference, the kind of readings you get around powerful magnetic fields or radio transmitters. And the digital recorder was picking up sounds that shouldn't have been there. Faint voices, conversations, what sounded like people crying or laughing, all coming from inside machines that were supposedly just washing clothes or keeping food cold. I started recording everything, documenting the modifications, trying to build some kind of evidence for what was happening. But the more I discovered, the more questions I had. The voices on the recordings weren't coming from outside sources. They seemed to be stored inside the machines themselves, like someone had found a way to capture and preserve human sounds, maybe even human thoughts. The storage containers weren't just collecting electrical energy, they were warm with something that felt almost alive. Looking back now, I think my sobriety probably saved my life. 3 years of recovery had taught me to trust my instincts, to pay attention when something felt wrong instead of numbing it with alcohol. My sponsor used to say that addiction was like giving up your soul in exchange for temporary relief, and getting sober meant learning to live with your full consciousness again. All the pain and fear and uncertainty that comes with being completely human. Maybe that's why I could sense what was happening in Willowdale when the residents couldn't. They'd had their souls systematically removed, leaving behind just the mechanical functions of daily life. It was December 23rd when I finally figured out what the machines were really doing. I was working on Mrs. Peterson's washing machine, running diagnostics on the modified electrical system, when I heard my own voice coming from the speakers. Not just my voice, my thoughts, my fears about staying sober, my memories of hitting rock bottom 3 years earlier. Somehow, the machine had recorded and stored parts of my consciousness every time I'd worked on it. The containers weren't just storage devices. They were preserving human souls, human emotions, everything that made people who they really were. I started tearing apart the modifications, disconnecting the storage containers and additional wiring. As soon as I disconnected the first container from Mrs. Peterson's washing machine, she collapsed in her kitchen. For about 30 seconds, she was completely unconscious. Then, she opened her eyes, looked around like she was seeing her house for the first time in months, and started crying. "Where are my grandchildren?" she whispered. "Why can't I remember my grandchildren? Why?" That night, I went house to house, disconnecting every modified appliance I could find. Each time I freed a storage container, the person it belonged to would collapse briefly and then wake up with their emotions and memories flooding back. But they were also terrified, confused about the lost time, unable to explain what had happened to them. Some of them remembered feeling like they were trapped inside their own bodies, aware but unable to connect with their feelings or memories. Others had no memory of the past several weeks at all. By Christmas Eve, I'd restored maybe half the town. That's when I realized something was hunting me. The entity responsible for the soul theft had noticed what I was doing, and it was angry. I started seeing it in reflections, mirrors, windows, puddles of water. a shifting presence that looked almost human but wrong, like someone had tried to recreate a person using only mechanical parts. It could speak using stolen voices, fragments of conversations it had collected from its victims. Sometimes it sounded like Mrs. Henderson asking about her grandchildren. Sometimes it used my own voice, telling me to stop interfering, threatening to take my hard-earned sobriety and leave me empty like the others. The final confrontation happened at the old Methodist church on the edge of town, where the entity had apparently set up some kind of central storage system for all the collected souls. The basement was full of larger machines, industrial-sized versions of the appliance modifications, with hundreds of storage containers holding the consciousness of people from Willowdale and probably other towns as well. The entity materialized fully for the first time, a hollow outline of a human form filled with swirling fragments of other people's memories and emotions. It tried to drain my consciousness the way it had drained the others, but recovery had taught me techniques for protecting my mental state that I'd never needed before. Meditation, mindfulness, the ability to observe my own thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. All the tools I'd learned to stay sober turned out to be exactly what I needed to resist soul theft. I was able to stay conscious long enough to start smashing the storage containers, releasing decades worth of collected human consciousness back to their rightful owners. The entity fought back by flooding me with stolen emotions, the terror of every person it had drained, the grief of parents who couldn't remember loving their children, the despair of people trapped in their own bodies. For a few minutes, I was drowning in other people's feelings, losing track of which thoughts and memories were actually mine. But then I remembered what my sponsor had taught me about accepting difficult emotions without being destroyed by them. I let the stolen feelings flow through me without trying to own them or fight them, just acknowledging their reality while maintaining my own identity. When the last storage container was destroyed, the entity collapsed. Not destroyed, exactly, but broken down into component parts. Fragments of stolen consciousness that scattered like smoke and gradually found their way back to their original owners. The industrial machines shut down, the electrical fields dissipated, and suddenly the church basement was just a basement again. It took weeks for Willowdale to fully recover. People had to rebuild relationships with family members they'd forgotten how to love, rediscover hobbies and interests that had been systematically drained from them, figure out what their lives were supposed to be like when they could actually feel emotions again. Some folks moved away, too disturbed by the experience to stay. Others grew closer than ever, grateful for the reminder that human connection isn't something to take for granted. I kept working as an appliance repair technician, but I started specializing in checking for unusual modifications. Word got around, not the full story, just rumors about my ability to spot equipment that wasn't working the way it should. I get calls now from other small towns where people are complaining that their appliances work fine, but something feels wrong. Usually, it's nothing, just normal wear and tear. But sometimes I find those extra components, those storage containers, warm with stolen consciousness. The entity I encountered in Willowdale wasn't unique. My sobriety is stronger now than it ever was before. Having your consciousness almost stolen teaches you to value your authentic thoughts and feelings, even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones. Recovery used to feel like constantly fighting against my own mind, but now I understand that my mind, all its fears and hopes and memories, is the most valuable thing I own. Nobody gets to take that away from me, no matter how much easier it might be to live without feeling everything so intensely. I still drive out to Willowdale sometimes, just to check on people. Mrs. Henderson shows me new pictures of her grandchildren every time I visit. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez hold hands when they walk to the mailbox. The kids play and fight and laugh like kids should. Their appliances work perfectly fine with standard manufacturer components, nothing modified or enhanced. Just machines that do their jobs and then shut off, leaving people free to live their actual lives. I'm 28, and up until last Christmas, I thought the worst part of my job was dealing with drunk college kids who couldn't remember their own address. My name's Tyler Banks, and I've been delivering pizza in Greensboro for about 3 years now. Not exactly the career I planned when I dropped out of NC State, but it pays the bills and keeps my student loans from completely destroying my credit. I live with 2 roommates in a crappy duplex near campus, work mostly nights, and spend my days sleeping off the smell of pepperoni and motor oil. December of last year, my manager asked if I wanted to pick up some extra shifts covering deliveries out to Pinewood, this tiny town about 40 minutes south of Greensboro. Population maybe 650 on a good day, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and strangers stick out like a sore thumb. The regular driver had broken his leg in some stupid accident, and they needed someone to cover the rural route through Christmas. I needed the money. My portion of rent was already 2 weeks late, and I had exactly $37 in my checking account. So I said yes, even though driving all the way out to Pinewood for a single delivery seemed like a waste of gas. The first few nights went smoothly. Pinewood sits in this valley, surrounded by rolling hills and patches of pine forest, connected to the main highway by a single winding road that cuts through farmland and old tobacco fields. Most of the houses are spread out along dirt roads with names like Old Mill Lane and Possum Creek Road, the kind of addresses that make GPS give up entirely. But the people were friendly, tipped well, and seemed genuinely happy to see a fresh face. I started recognizing the regulars pretty quick. Mrs. Henderson, who always ordered a large Supreme on Friday nights. The Davis family, who got 3 medium pizzas every Sunday after church. Old Mr. Patterson, who lived alone in a trailer and always wanted exact change. The work was actually easier than delivering in the city. No apartment complexes with confusing numbering systems, no parking nightmares, no sketchy neighborhoods where you worry about getting robbed, just quiet country roads, porch lights cutting through the darkness, and the sound of dogs barking in the distance. I started to prefer the Pinewood route. It was peaceful out there, almost meditative, after dealing with the chaos of college town deliveries all week. December 20th was when things started getting weird. I pulled up to the Henderson place around 8:30, grabbed their usual large Supreme from the warming bag, and walked up to the front door. Mrs. Henderson answered before I could even knock, looking confused and a little annoyed. "Tyler, honey, what are you doing back here?" she asked, not opening the storm door all the way. "You already brought our pizza an hour ago." I stared at her, holding the pizza box. "Ma'am, this is my first delivery tonight. I just left the shop 20 minutes ago." "No, you were definitely here earlier," she insisted, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a receipt. "Look, you signed this yourself." She held up the slip of paper, and sure enough, there was my signature. That same sloppy scrawl I'd been using since high school. But I had no memory of being there before. "Mrs. Henderson, I promise you, I haven't been here tonight. This is the first delivery on my route." I checked my delivery log on my phone, scrolling through the night's orders. "See? Your address is number 1 on my list." She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, then down at the receipt in her hand. "Tyler, I watched you walk back to your car. Same red Honda, same pizza uniform. You even made that joke about the weather being too warm for December." The thing is, I had been thinking about how unusually warm it was for December, mid-60s instead of the usual 40s. But I'd never said anything out loud about it. I ended up giving her the second pizza for free, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. She accepted it but kept looking at me strangely, like she was trying to figure out what kind of scam I was running. On the drive back to town, I called the shop to ask if there had been some mistake with the orders. Maybe they'd sent someone else out earlier. But Marco, the night manager, confirmed that I was the only driver covering Pinewood, and their system showed only one order for the Henderson address. The next night, December 21st, it happened again, this time at the Davis house. Mr. Davis came to the door already counting out exact change, thanking me for coming back so quickly. When I told him I hadn't been there before, he got this look on his face like I was trying to pull some kind of con. "Son, you dropped off 2 large pepperonis not 30 minutes ago." My wife's still eating her second slice. Through the window behind him, I could see Mrs. Davis sitting at their kitchen table with a half-eaten slice of pizza in front of her. "Sir, I swear on my mother's grave, this is my first stop tonight," I said. But he was already shaking his head. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not paying twice for the same order." He started to close the door, then paused. "Though I gotta say, you seem different than you did earlier. I don't know, more nervous or something." That comment stuck with me. More nervous. What had the other Tyler been like? Confident? Relaxed? I spent the rest of my shift trying to remember every detail of my interactions with customers. wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown or blackout episodes. But I felt fine, tired, sure, but not sick or confused, just really freaked out. By December 22nd, I was dreading the Pinewood route. I'd started keeping detailed notes about every delivery, times, addresses, what customers ordered, what they wore, what we talked about. I figured if I was having memory problems, at least I'd have some record of what was actually happening. But when I got to Old Mill Lane that night, things got a whole lot worse. I was walking up to the Patterson place when I saw movement near the side of the house. Someone in a red pizza uniform, just like mine, walking away from the front door and heading toward the road. The figure was maybe 50 yards away, partially hidden by the shadows from Mr. Patterson's big oak tree, but I could clearly see it was someone my height, my build, wearing the same uniform. "Hey!" I called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light. I ran toward where I'd seen it, my heart hammering against my ribs, but found nothing except empty road and the sound of wind moving through bare branches. When Mr. Patterson answered his door, he was already reaching for his wallet. "That was quick, Tyler. Good thing you came back. I forgot to give you a tip earlier." The pizza box in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "Mr. Patterson, when was I here earlier?" "Oh, maybe 10 minutes ago. You dropped off my usual medium cheese. We chatted about the weather." "Nice night for December, isn't it?" He peered at me more closely. "You feeling okay, son? You look a little pale." I was more than a little pale. I felt like I was going to throw up. Someone else had been making my deliveries, someone who looked exactly like me, wearing my uniform, driving what must have been an identical car. Someone who knew the customers, knew their orders, even knew their names. That night, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I parked on the main road leading out of Pinewood and waited. Engine running, heater blasting. If someone was impersonating me, maybe they'd have to leave town the same way I did. I sat there for 2 hours, watching every car that passed, but saw nothing unusual. Just locals heading home from the bar or the late shift at the poultry plant. The next night, December 23rd, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money. And honestly, I needed answers. I armed myself with a small digital camera, one of those cheap ones you can get at the pharmacy, and a flashlight. If I saw my impersonator again, I was going to get proof. The first few deliveries went normally, which somehow made me even more nervous. By the time I got to Possum Creek Road for my last stop of the night, my hands were shaking and I was jumping at every shadow. The house sat back from the road, connected by a long gravel driveway that wound through a patch of pine trees. As I got out of my car, I heard what sounded like another car door slamming somewhere in the darkness ahead. I grabbed my camera and flashlight and started up the driveway. About halfway to the house, I saw him, or rather, I saw me. Standing on the front porch in the yellow glow of the porch light was someone who looked exactly like Tyler Banks. Same height, same build, same face, same red Honda Civic shirt and black uniform cap. The only difference was the way he moved. More confident, more relaxed. Like he belonged there in a way I never did. I watched myself knock on the door, watched the customer answer with a smile, watched this other Tyler chat and laugh like they were old friends. When the transaction was complete, my doppelganger turned and started walking back down the porch steps. That's when he saw me standing there in the shadows. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Up close, the resemblance was perfect. Every detail of my face reproduced exactly. But there was something wrong with the eyes, something that didn't quite match. They were my eyes, but emptier somehow, like looking at a photograph instead of a living person. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, and the voice was mine too, but the tone was all wrong, cold and predatory. "What are you?" I managed to ask, raising the camera with trembling hands. Instead of answering, the thing that looked like me smiled, and that's when I saw the first crack in its disguise. The smile was too wide, stretching my face in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "I'm you, Tyler. The better version. The one people actually like." I hit the camera's flash button, and the sudden burst of light revealed what I'd been talking to. For just a split second, the human appearance flickered, and I saw something underneath, a mass of writhing, pale flesh that shifted and moved like it was trying to remember what shape it was supposed to hold. Then the light faded, and it looked like me again. "The customers prefer me," it continued, taking a step closer. Mrs. Henderson says I'm more polite than you used to be. The Davis family thinks I'm friendlier. Even old Mr. Patterson enjoys our conversations more. Another step, I've been getting better tips too. Funny how much people appreciate good service. I started backing away, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. What do you want? Your life, it said simply. Your job, your apartment, your friends. I've been practicing, getting better at being Tyler Banks. Soon I won't need you at all. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, crashing through the pine trees, branches tearing at my uniform and scratching my face. Behind me, I could hear something following, not footsteps exactly, but a wet, sliding sound like something enormous trying to move quickly over the forest floor. I made it to my car and locked the doors, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the creature's true form. A writhing mass of flesh about the size of a person, with tendrils that reached out like fingers, testing the air. Then my headlights swept across it as I backed up, and it collapsed back into my appearance, standing there in the driveway like nothing had happened. I drove straight to the Greensboro police station and tried to file a report, but how do you explain that something is stealing your identity by literally becoming you? The desk sergeant looked at me like I'd been smoking something illegal and suggested I might want to talk to someone about stress. I went home instead, called in sick for the rest of the week, and tried to figure out what to do. But the thing didn't stop with the pizza deliveries. Over the next few days, my roommate started making comments about how I seemed different lately, more outgoing, more helpful around the house. My ex-girlfriend Sarah called to thank me for the thoughtful text message I'd apparently sent her, even though I hadn't contacted her in months. When I asked to see the message, it was from my phone number and signed with my name, but I'd never written it. The creature was expanding its impersonation, becoming me in more and more aspects of my life. And the worst part was, everyone seemed to prefer this version of Tyler Banks. On Christmas Eve, I decided to end it. I drove back out to Pinewood, armed with every camera and recording device I could borrow, determined to get proof of what was happening. If I could document the creature's existence, maybe someone would believe me. I found it at the pizza shop, standing behind the counter in my uniform, chatting with Marco like they were old friends. When Marco saw me come through the door, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, then something like fear. "Tyler," he said, looking back and forth between me and my imposter. "What the hell is going on here?" The creature turned toward me, still wearing my face, and smiled that too wide smile. "Just a little family reunion," it said. "That's not Tyler," I told Marco, pointing at the thing behind the counter. "That's some kind of... I don't know what it is, but it's been impersonating me for weeks." Marco stepped back, reaching for the phone. "I'm calling the police. This is some kind of sick joke." "Go ahead," the creature said. "Call them. Ask them which Tyler Banks has been making deliveries for the past week. Check the security footage. Look at the delivery logs. I think you'll find that I'm the one who's been showing up for work." And it was right. When the police arrived, they found that the security cameras showed my face on someone who'd been working regular shifts, someone who'd been polite to customers and efficient with deliveries, someone who'd been a better employee than I'd ever been. The delivery logs were all signed in my handwriting. The customers all vouched for Tyler's excellent service. According to every piece of evidence, the creature was the real Tyler Banks, and I was some kind of imposter. It took weeks to sort out the mess. DNA tests, fingerprint analysis, interviews with family and friends who could vouch for details about my life that the creature couldn't possibly know. Gradually, the truth emerged. Not that anyone really understood it, but at least they accepted that I was the original. The creature disappeared during the investigation. One day it was there, answering questions and maintaining its perfect impersonation, and the next day it was gone. The police found some kind of residue in the back room of the pizza shop, a clear, jelly-like substance that smelled like copper and rotting meat. The lab tests came back inconclusive. I never went back to delivering pizza. Couldn't handle the thought of driving those dark country roads, wondering if something might be watching me. Learning to be me. I got a day job at a hardware store. Work that keeps me indoors and around other people. I moved out of the duplex and got my own apartment, somewhere with good locks and bright lights. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the creature found someone else to copy. Some other person with a simple, unremarkable life that could be easily stolen and improved upon. I watch the news for stories about identity theft or people acting strangely, but if the creature is still out there, it's gotten better at hiding. The worst part is the doubt it left behind. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if the creature was right, if it really was a better version of me. People did seem to prefer its company. It was more confident, more personable, more successful at the simple job of delivering pizza and making customers happy. Maybe that's the real horror. Not that something tried to steal my life, but that it might have been an improvement.